Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Today we begin our fifth lecture by looking at Missouri as the state, like the rest of the nation, stood upon the brink of civil war. Our focus today will be the pivotal events that unfolded in St. Louis, beginning in February 1861. Delegates from across Missouri gathered in the city to decide whether to remain within the Union. We'll next look at the ways in which Unionist and secessionist leaders in Missouri maneuvered to secure control of a key federal arsenal in St. Louis. And finally, we conclude with Nathaniel Lyon, a Union officer whose aggressive actions both to take that arsenal and to break up the pro-Southern muster of state militia. Lyon's bold actions will help to keep that arsenal in Union hands, but his seizure of Camp Jackson led to a civilian massacre and days of chaos in the city. This led to growing hostility toward federal power in the state, and it would soon plunge Missouri into civil war. Many of you now no doubt know the history of the American Civil War to some extent. Yet as we look backward, knowing full well how this story ends, it's important that we remember that the people living in that time certainly did not know how things would go. This idea of contingency is a key theme when you study history. Things can always break any number of ways. People make choices, they take actions, and those then have direct consequences, which then have consequences of their own. And just as we can't be sure where events will lead our world tomorrow or next week or certainly next year, the Americans who lived through that Secession Winter of 1860 and 1861 were likewise unsure. And even more, they were uneasy. It was not clear whether the lame duck president, James Buchanan, or his replacement, Abraham Lincoln, who was set to be inaugurated in March. It wasn't until the 20th century that Inauguration Day was moved up to January. It was unclear if Lincoln would allow the 7 states that had seceded to leave the Union peacefully. Buchanan, frankly, had not done much of anything. Some Missourians and many Southerners feared that Lincoln would take aggressive action to preserve the Union, keeping those Southern states within it. They described such aggressive action, including the use of military force, as coercion. Although 7 slave states had seceded, 8 more, including Missouri, had not. Last time we looked at the elections of 1860 and saw that within the sectional crisis, most Missourians sought to chart a moderate course between factional extremes. The outgoing governor of Missouri, Robert Stewart, affirmed the state's neutrality and denounced the prospect of federal coercion. Missouri, he wrote, was, quote, able to take care of itself and will be neither forced nor flattered, driven or coaxed into a course of action that must end in her own destruction, end quote. Most Missourians continued to show strong support for the Union. The citizens of Marshall, Missouri, in the heart of the Little Dixie region, held a mass meeting on December 15, 1860. Most of the adult participants at this gathering had come from the Upper South or had strong kinship ties to that region. But the resolution they approved that day by a resounding majority affirmed their support for the U.S. Constitution, not for secession. On January 3, 1861, Claiborne Fox Jackson was sworn in as Missouri's 15th governor. Publicly, he shared Stewart's support for armed neutrality, but he worked actively to prepare for the possibility of secession. In late January, he requisitioned Missouri's quota of arms from the Ordnance Bureau in Washington, D.C. This amounted to 410 muskets, 302 rifles, 40 cavalry sabers, and a gun carriage for a 6-pound cannon. Jackson also called in January for an election in which Missouri voters would choose delegates for a statewide convention to determine the state's relationship to the federal union. Almost 80% of the men elected to this convention were avowed Unionists. Most of these delegates also owned slaves. Yet when they met in St. Louis to vote upon secession, they rejected it decisively. The resolution that, quote, no adequate cause existed to impel Missouri to dissolve her connections with the federal union, end quote, passed by a 9-1 margin. The Confederate States of America had been formed on February 8, 1861, but Missourians, through their duly elected delegates, refused to join the Confederacy. This meant that Missouri was the only state to hold such a convention and vote against severing ties with the Union. Missourians took their position in the middle, both politically and geographically, seriously. When Kentuckian John Crittenden proposed a sectional compromise that would have extended the old Missouri Compromise line westward to the Pacific, most Missourians thought that an eminently sensible idea. That secession convention in St. Louis endorsed that proposal. The convention thus dashed Governor Jackson's secessionist hopes, but he still hatched a plan that he believed would maneuver Missouri into the Confederacy. Claiborne Jackson believed that federal coercion was geographically inevitable. Because of Missouri's strategic location along the vital rivers, the federal government would need to move large numbers of men and materiel along or through the state's borders. The governor believed that such actions would encroach upon Missouri's neutrality. Couching himself as the state's defender against such a federal action, Jackson knew that many Missourians feared coercion, and he waited for events to nudge them towards secession. After Confederate troops fired upon federal troops at Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, in South Carolina, President Lincoln declared that the seceded states were in rebellion. The president called for 75,000 federal troops to put down this rebellion. Missouri's share would be 3,123 men. Claiborne Jackson, however, denounced the request. He wrote to Lincoln, "Your requisition is illegal, unconstitutional, and revolutionary. In its object, inhuman and diabolical. Not one man will Missouri furnish to carry on any such unholy crusade against her Southern sisters." End quote. Jackson did summon the state militia into training, calling upon district commanders to muster their volunteers into 6-day encampments across the state. One of these camps was to be established somewhere in St. Louis, under the direction of Daniel Frost, the West Point graduate who had recently led the Southwest expedition to the Kansas border. When the governor rejected Lincoln's call for troops, Frank Blair immediately offered his St. Louis Home Guards to meet the quota. A staunch Unionist, Blair came from one of the most politically powerful families in Missouri. Although the Blairs had once owned slaves, the family patriarch, Francis Blair Sr., became one of the founders of the Republican Party. His other son, Montgomery Blair, soon became Lincoln's Postmaster General. On April 20th, on the other side of the state, Confederate sympathizers seized the Missouri Depot, just outside the town of Liberty. That Clay County arsenal held only 4 old pieces of artillery and about 1,500 small arms. The Blairs, like Union officer Nathaniel Lyon, feared that the St. Louis arsenal, which was a much bigger prize, was next. That was the largest federal arsenal in the slave states, the one in St. Louis. A 3-story brick building, it held 60,000 muskets, 45 tons of powder, siege guns, and machinery to manufacture other arms. There were fewer than 100 enlisted men to protect it. Blair persuaded the War Department in Washington to recall William Harney, the commanding federal officer for the Department of the West. The command in St. Louis thus fell temporarily to Captain Nathaniel Lyon, who had just been transferred to the city with 80 soldiers who had recently been stationed in Kansas. Lyon arrived in St. Louis with a reputation. He was known as one of the most tyrannical officers in the entire U.S. Army. He was a strict disciplinarian. He had an aggressive personality, an obsessive sense of duty, and a fierce devotion to the Union. He stood 5'7" with reddish hair and a ruddy complexion. Lyon emerged as one of the most critical figures in the entire war in Missouri. He recruited and armed even more Union volunteers and then moved boldly to secure the arsenal. On April 26th, Lyon transferred the munitions from the arsenal across the river to Illinois, and the danger that secessionists could capture this prize seemed to pass. On May 6th, Brigadier General Daniel Frost established his encampment of volunteers just west of St. Louis at Lindell Grove. The muster consisted of 2 regiments of infantry, 3 troops of cavalry, and an artillery battery. Frost's men called their tent city Camp Jackson, after the governor. Unbeknownst to the public, Claiborne Jackson had already requested arms from the Confederate government. Arms that had been seized from the federal arsenal in Louisiana arrived at Lindale Grove on May 8th in heavy packing crates marked as marble. As it turned out, neither of these two pieces of artillery were ever assembled, nor did Frost's men ever have the chance to use them. What had happened? Nathaniel Lyon conducted a personal reconnaissance of the Lindale Grove muster, and this only deepened his suspicions. Dressed as the mother-in-law of Frank Blair, he went out for a spring carriage ride. He passed near Camp Jackson and saw rebel flags flying from several of its tents. Several of the streets were marked with handmade signs for Jefferson Davis and other Southern leaders. On May 9th, Lyon called a meeting of St. Louis's Union Committee of Safety. He announced his decision to move upon the state militia at Camp Jackson. Two of his aides opposed the decision. They noted the camp was only organized for 6 days, that it had caused no disturbances, and that the stolen federal property, which they suspected was in Frost's possession, that it could be taken back with a federal marshal issuing a writ of replevin. Lyon rejected this suggestion, and he marched upon Camp Jackson. He demanded Frost's surrender, accusing his men of harboring both secessionist sympathies and federal materials of war. The numerical advantages here clearly lay with Lyon. He had nearly 8,000 men with him. Frost had just under 900 men, and no real choice except to surrender. Frost did protest, saying that Lyon lacked the authority for such bold action. This surrender left Lyon with few options. He lacked a prison camp to hold Frost's men. This meant that he could only parole the state militia, make them swear allegiance to the federal government, and then let them go. But to make an example of these men to other disloyal residents, Lyon decided to force them on a march through the city toward the arsenal, which was about 6 miles away. As Lyon's men marched the state militia away from Camp Jackson, a large crowd of civilians began to gather. Men, women, and children lined the streets of St. Louis. Some of these bystanders hurled insults and ethnic slurs toward the federal troops, many of whom were German immigrants, and rocks and bottles were thrown. A gun fired. Lyon's troops fired back before any of the Union officers could gain control of the situation. In the resulting mayhem, 28 civilians died, including 1 woman and 5 teenagers. 75 more were injured. 2 of Lyon's men and 3 of the prisoners also died. Rioting engulfed much of the city in the days that followed. Among the eyewitnesses to these chaotic events was William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had recently resigned as the head of a military academy in Louisiana. He'd become the president of the 5th Street Railroad, a St. Louis streetcar company. When shots broke out, Sherman fell to the ground, covering the body of his son Willie. Neither was hurt, and days later, Sherman wrote, "We cannot have 2 kings. One is enough. And of the 2, the United States must prevail. But in all of the South, and even here, there are plenty who think that their state is their king." Sherman correctly surmised the deep political divisions within Missouri. The Camp Jackson riot only sharpened these differences. Because of Lyon's heavy-handed actions, several conditional Unionists who had balked at the prospect of federal coercion, they now moved toward the secessionist camp. Many Missourians rallied behind Claiborne Jackson. Next time, we will consider the governor's response to Camp Jackson and how mounting tensions threatened this fragile neutrality in Missouri. Until then.